So, good morning, everybody. Welcome to November's coffee break briefing. Can't believe I'm saying that already. Next month will be the last one of 2025. We are talking today, as advertised, about AI in the workplace, particular focus on the recent boom that I suppose we can all say we've seen in the use of AI tools, both within the workplace and outside of it. Absolutely delighted today to be joined by yet another willing victim in the form of Myles Hudson from our in-house IT team. So Myles, thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure.
I will come on to Myles's involvement shortly, but needless to say, the importance of this was having somebody on board who knows more than I do about AI. I don't think that Myles would necessarily hold himself out as a global expert, but he certainly knows more than I do. That's all we needed for today. So what is the format of today? What are we talking about? There's a lot that I want to get through, a lot I want to be able to talk about. We have only got the hour because I am going to be kicked out of this room, unfortunately. So, focus for today. I've already mentioned we've seen this sort of rapid adoption of the use of AI software, AI platforms and AI systems over the last few years, particularly in the last couple of years. Very much media focused, very much concern from workplaces, from schools, and particularly prevalent in the younger workforce, of course, who are always slightly more technically minded than the rest of us, and of course are growing up using and exposed to these systems. The use of AI in the workplace and beyond presents a huge number of opportunities. This is, in a sense, probably one of the bigger cutting edge elements of technology coming into the workplace that we've seen for a very, very long time. But as with any technological development, as with any major change, it is always going to present risks. And to be fair, it is those risks that we are seeing in the media all the time and being talked about. We will cover some of those during the course of today's session, and we will talk about some of the opportunities and some of the way of mitigating some of those risks as well. So, general outline for today. Main reason I've got Myles on board is so that he can provide some technical grounding for us. We'll spend the first sort of 10 minutes or so looking at this from a slightly more technical perspective, get Myles' input on exactly what we're talking about when we talk about AI systems, when we are talking about the way it's integrated into the workplace, all of the different technical language that we see being used around AI. So we'll spend sort of 10 minutes having that as general conversation first. We'll move into the legal implications, the use in recruitment, data protection, confidentiality, how your staff are using AI tools and how you may want to administer that. And throughout, as always, a few practical takeaways in your workplace. So, as I say, first maybe 5-10 minutes or so, good chat with Myles, building some of the technical background, what we're actually talking about here. I'm going to throw some questions at him. As always, session's being recorded. It will be available on the Freston's YouTube page once we're done. It will be circulated to everybody. And as always, please do make use of the Q&A. Please do make use of the chat function to ask questions as we go. Please be nice to Myles. I know at least one person on the call probably won't be, but we'll do what we can and we'll come up with as much information as we can moving forward. So let's start. Myles, again, thank you for joining us. Like I said, I know you're not holding yourself out as an absolute expert on AI. You certainly know more than I do. And I hope most people on the call won't mind me saying you probably know more than they do. So focus with the start bit, really. Let's just go with the big questions as an opening gambit. When we say AI, we kind of all got this image in our heads, and it's a very different image that various people have got. Some will be flicking to some of the big names of things that are going out at the moment. Some of us will remember sci-fi films growing up and what AI looked like. Some of us were thinking, you know, HAL and that kind of thing. What do we actually mean when we say AI? What does that mean to you?
So AI is essentially a machine or a program doing tasks that typically requires human thinking, such as writing, analysing and making decisions based on context. It's not magic, it's not a robot brain as per se, it's just software that can learn patterns and make smart guesses. It doesn't think, it's trained on massive histories of data to spot patterns and respond in ways that align with previous given information. So think of it as like a super smart autocomplete from, you know, texting on your mobile phone. Your phone can predict the next word when you type, And AI tools like ChatGPT and other things we're going to look at in this webinar, it does the same thing but just on a bigger scale. So it sounds more conversational and more friendlier to the human eye.
Yeah, and I suppose most of us on this call will be familiar with maybe the backdrop to this. You mentioned predictive text there. We'd all have used chatbots historically. Is this just the next progression of that?
It is. It's just more context driven. It's taking that idea of that autocomplete and applying it to, as I say, bigger presets of data and other what's the word? Subjects.
Yeah, and I suppose in a way where we've got this maybe recent explosion in it, what we're actually talking about is the public access to these new systems and models, really, isn't it? It's this wider rollout of tech that's already been there, that is just a development of things we've seen in the past. It's exciting, it's presenting opportunities, certainly for people.
Yeah.
Fine. So that I think nicely frames what we're talking about when we mean an AI system. This isn't terrifying, it's going to take over the world next week kind of thing. I don't think we need to worry about the robot apocalypse coming anytime soon. And there is a commonly thrown around phrase, particularly within HR employment, I'm assuming within your circles as well. AI is not replacing a huge number of workers at the moment. That's not this kind of immediate concern we need to have. But I think the background to this is people using AI systems, people using AI tools are going to replace people who aren't. I think that's probably a fair assessment at the moment. Would you be inclined to agree with that at the moment? For the most part.
I would 100% agree with that, yeah.
Excellent. So let's take the next step then. We've got the AI models. We've kind of talked about what AI is in the background to all of this. We've then got this idea of the publicly accessible tools versus the ones that organizations, companies, businesses are setting up privately. Two questions there really to build us into this. What do we actually mean in the difference between those two terms? And maybe we'll start there. I know I've sort of briefly summarized it. But as the extension of that, maybe run through some of the bigger public tools for us, where you see them being used, and between us, I think we can cover the risks.
Yeah, so public and private AI tools. Public AI tools are your big names like Google Gemini, your ChatGPT, and your Microsoft 365 Copilot. That is the publicly accessible one. They are driven by, you sign up to a website and you get given access to this tool that runs on a version of any sort of AI-driven model. These can be used for creating text, creating images, and they're very good at simple processes. Some things like data manipulation, they are very good at doing those sorts of things. Private AI tools can be hosted what we would call internally. So in your organization, you may have a tool of some description that is run by the company, that is based off of company data to, adapt or take that data and manipulate it in some sort of way to give you your desired result. So some tools for that are the Microsoft Copilot for enterprise use and the enterprise version of ChatGPT, which is run by OpenAI. Normally in the private AI tools sector, the data remains within the company, and keeping that data within the company is very important. Because obviously uploading a load of company data to a public AI tool could give you a couple of breaches, which you don't really want. So having that boundary between publicly accessible tools and private tools sort of gives you that separation between the public eye and the people that should only see that sort of information.
Good, thank you. Yeah.
So I was just to say some risks of using these AI tools in the private sense is that Chris will probably touch on later, but using it for a lot of decision making can introduce some bias. They can adapt very quickly to know what you think is right and wrong. And as I said earlier, it's all based on context. So if you say something, oh, this is correct and this isn't correct, it will then adapt to understand this is correct and this is not correct. So.
Yeah, and I think that's going to become a recurring theme in what we both say. Ultimately, these models are simply data-based systems. You know, they are learning, for lack of a better phrase, of what we input into them, and that risk inherently, therefore, comes from what data is being fed in, and is therefore going to produce the output. And as Myles says, I will come on to examples of that. There's already been case law on this. There's already been ICO, EHRC comments on it. Which I will come back to later in the session. In terms of sort of that public versus private, again, we'll come back to this later. There will be conversations around which platforms we're happy for staff to use, which we're not, and in what context. That's a conversation we've had internally. That's a conversation we're still having internally about how that works. I'm sure the firm won't mind me saying we are facilitating allowing some use of AI platforms within our workplace, subject to very, very strict rules, which I'll come back to in terms of policy and management later. Fine. So public versus private, kind of covered that off a little bit. Some of the risks we'll come back to later in the session, as we say. Let's move on to the next one. The other kind of big word that often or phrase, I suppose, that gets thrown out is this idea of a large language model. Now, this is a question that was put to me when I said that I was going to do this session. I know Myles is going to explain straight away that there's a misconception within the question. So I'll let him take straight over at the moment, because there are two separate questions here. What's a large language model, an LLM? And it says, such as ChatGPT, is ChatGPT an LLM?
So large language models are the core fundamental system of the AI system, which are trained on huge amounts of text and information and historical data. Think of it more as like a car. It's built around the engine. The engine would be the LLM, in this case, the large language model, and ChatGPT would be the full vehicle with seats, dashboard, you know, that sort of thing. So the ChatGPT interface is how you interact with the large language model. And companies like OpenAI that run and host ChatGPT, they go out and they create newer versions of the GPT model to sort of put behind ChatGPT to give it more, oomph, give it more information to work with. In the sense of not providing context, but helping it understand what you're giving it better. So, as I say, a very common misconception, ChatGPT is not a large language model. Large language models can interact and write language in a human-like way. They're very useful for summaries, drafting emails, writing content, answering questions. They can go off and search the web if you permit them to. But they don't actually understand the information you're giving them or the information they're reading back to you. They are just very good at predicting what words would come next. Again, back to that very super smart autocomplete idea we had at the beginning. Context is crucial for large language models because it helps them understand meaning. They maintain coherence, they resolve ambiguity and make accurate predictions. The more context and the more content you feed into it, the better your responses will be. ChatGPT, in this case, it's an application. It's built on top of the large language model. There are other applications like Copilot, Google Gemini. They all use the GPT large language model behind it, but they all have a different interface on the front. And that sort of differentiates the programs that other companies can go off, build, create, design. But fundamentally, they all run on the same system or same sets of systems that all have this idea of wanting to create and learn, adapt, and help you in a way where it's not
not too superficial, maybe. Or
yeah, it's not going to just go off and create it by itself. You know, it has to be told.
Yeah, because we've inputted this data, as we keep coming back to. I like the car and the engine analogy there. I think that's quite a useful way to help understand this. Certainly did for me when I was doing my digging into this. So you've talked there about sort of, and we've used the predictive text building on that idea before. That leads us into kind of the last technical element that I think we just want to cover off before building into the session, and that's ultimately this idea of generative AI and other forms of AI tech. So I think the question is, generative AI is probably the thing that's dominating the headlines at the moment, in a sense, for obvious reasons. What do we mean by that, and what is the difference between a generative AI platform and other types of AI system?
So generative AI it's used to create new content that may not have been created before. So that's giving a system ideas and, as I say, again, context, and it will go off and run its thought processes and run its algorithms to create this new thing that you want, this new thing you've told it to go off and create. Predictive AI, which is a different type of AI system that we could investigate here. It's more focused around that pre-existing data set that we can feed it, that it can run off of, and that it can manipulate and extrapolate data from. Yeah, the generative AI aspect is your create me this, write me a 500-word essay on XYZ. Predictive text would be more your analyze this bit of data and tell me the biggest, most interesting trend against XYZ.
Yeah, and I suppose within those, then, generative AI, as we say, is kind of capturing the headlines at the moment, because that is the sort of the new public tech. That is the stick this into ChatGPT, and as you say, it writes my homework for me, or it produces this AI video or this AI photo for me, or whatever the case may be. And that's certainly the overlapping what we were saying earlier, I suppose, the public access to these public systems. Where you then talk about predictive AI as a separate example, is that, I suppose, in a sense, therefore, more likely to be your internal generative, in a sense, generative, but not strictly generative systems, therefore. So a company, for example, is saying, input this data and produce our standard reports on it for me.
Yes, so they would. They could both be used both internally and externally. There's no set idea behind it. It's more what an organisation, what their needs for the business would be. But yeah, that idea of generative, predictive. I'm sure there's another one in there, but there are other types of subsections where we can explore these ideas of generative.
Excellent. So I think in terms of the technical overview, that's all we sort of intended to cover on that side. We're going to spend most of the rest of the session talking about this from an employment, from an HR, and from a more legal focus. Myles, I'm going to ask you to stay on the call, because no doubt you're going to be able to chip in at various times as I start talking, particularly when I get onto things like data leaks. You've hinted at inputting company information, for example, confidentiality, data protection. All of that is going to come up in the rest of the session. I am keeping an eye on kind of Q&A and chat as we go. If anybody's got anything you want me to put to Myles as we go through, or anything you want Myles to follow up on towards the end, please do. I will try and leave 5 minutes for questions towards the end of the session if we possibly can. So, legal considerations, then, factoring in most of what Myles has just talked to us about in terms of employment law and the overlap with AI models and systems. I want to start by talking about recruitment and selection, and that will be the focus for today, because it sets, I think, a useful background to which we can kind of apply everything else. It's one of the most common places that AI systems are being used at the moment: CV screening, interview analysis, and the decision ultimately whether to recruit somebody or not. So the key considerations when we're looking at that, or indeed when we're looking at any kind of AI decision-making process internally, as Myles alluded to earlier, there is that risk of bias or discrimination, both of which I'll come on to in more detail, because whatever you're asking your AI system to analyse, it's doing so against this backdrop of the data that you fed into it. There will be transparency issues, data protection concerns to take into account if you're using AI systems and inputting personal data. I will come back in more detail on GDPR. Those of you who get excited about GDPR, I have got an entire extract for us to look at. The other side of where it's being used, of course, in recruitment and selection is the use by applicants themselves. So AI-generated CVs, application processes, and indeed interview responses. You know, those of you who are doing video competency-based interviews, how sure are you that your applicant is not sat there with ChatGPT open on their tablet next to them while talking to you? This, again, a consideration to start factoring in that may not have the technical side of a concern to be flagging here, but might give rise to you from an HR perspective to have cause for concern about the actual capacity of the individual that you're recruiting. So, looking at some of these in a bit more detail, let's kind of start with the transparency side and how we address this. I think, like everything, it's a recurring message when I present on almost any topic. Transparency on both sides is important. The best way to defeat an issue is to be quite open and clear about your expectations and also what is expected and what's being done by the other party. So, can we ask applicants if they've made use of AI tools? Yes, you absolutely can. There is absolutely no reason on your application form not to have a tick box at the end that says basically, I have not, or I have to some extent made use of another AI platform for the purposes of producing this application process. Something else that's become increasingly common, and this I might ask Myles to come straight back in on very quickly, AI detection software. There are a few out there that say, if you input all of this, somebody's written you a letter, input it in, and we'll tell you what percentage it's AI generated. Those of us who've been at a university in the last sort of 20 or 30 years will be familiar with plagiarism detection software like Turnitin. This is broadly similar. There's a couple of websites offering this as a service. I've not made use of this, Myles. I don't know if this is one that you want to chop a pin on and maybe give your thoughts as to the potential reliability of that, I think, if anything else.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's a good example of our historical based systems. You know, they go off and look at the data, and if they say they can detect, there's obviously patterns that AI systems will use, and what other AI systems can do is they can pick up on those patterns, which gives you your detection. There are very, very simple ways that ChatGPT, for example, can structure their responses. They normally give it, going back to my school days, we used to do like little pill paragraphs. So you have your point, evidence, explain, link. It'll do it in a very, very similar way. There will be like a main point, a small explanation, another explanation, and then a summary at the bottom. So that's how it can do its detection. And there have been sometimes I've done a very good piece of work, and it's been put through a bit of detection software, and it's come up saying that it's all 100% or 98.4% AI, and I'm like, oh, no, it's not. So yeah, there are, you know, it can be reliable if it detects and it looks AI written, which some things can be, some things can't be. Again, it's just that risk that you've got to understand that it's a system trying to understand another bit of systems work, if it is. Yeah,
and it comes back to the same point we were making before. You mentioned it well at the start of that response. It's about the input that's been put in the first place. What's it learning from? If we're saying ChatGPT generates responses that generally look like that very structured, as you say, sentence, sort of exposition, and then summary, which is a large amount of ChatGPT content when you ask it to do something, then all we're asking here is anything that looks like that carries the risk of being flagged as AI generated, which may not be the case. I have a great question about discrimination implications for this, which I will come on to briefly. But yes, this is always something that we're concerned about in the background here, is what policy, what procedure have we got in place that might carry the risk of being discriminatory? Doesn't anti-AI standpoint for CB, risk being discriminatory for people with dyslexia is a good example used here. Yeah, arguably, an absolute blanket ban does carry the risk of being an indirect discrimination claim. As an organisation, you are then going to have to come up with your usual set of justifications to defend that potential indirect discrimination, or even conceivably reasonable adjustments argument. My view on it is basically going to be, and I think this will probably be fairly consistent with Myles as well, absolute bans on these sort of systems and their use is unlikely to be effective. You're not going to catch everybody using it anyway. People are going to use it regardless, and these are systems that carry a huge amount of potential benefits as well as the risks. It's all about balancing those and working out how best works for your organization. So yes, in summary to the question, there's always a risk. There's always a risk of having a policy that carries the risk of discriminating against somebody. That does, to me, strike as potential indirect discrimination claims, so usual justification. Do I have a legitimate business aim I'm trying to achieve here by implementing this policy? And is this a proportionate way of doing it? That said, in terms of CVs and also decision making, I'll come on to that in a little bit more detail because there's another issue to consider there as well. Third one I've mentioned there is about relying on your offer terms. Now, don't forget, strictly speaking, you can always put a line in your offer, in your contract, that says this is being made on the basis that all of the information you have given to me is true, verifiable, da-da-da-da-da. That is an option to put in there. And if it is later found that somebody has managed to use AI to draft an application, for example, or to assist them in a way that is not appropriate to your application process, then what you've got there is an argument that they have fraudulently engaged in their application process. That could be gross misconduct dismissal, it could be a breach of contract. Final point just to make on this slide in terms of how you manage the use of AI in sort of recruitment and selection processes, consider reducing the whole paperwork application process significantly and or completely. Shift to competency-based interviews, assessments, and application procedures. These are things that are much harder for somebody to AI generate if you're keeping an eye on the process and the procedure. And tied in nicely with upcoming changes to the law, assuming the Employment Rights Bill does ever actually pass. Don't forget that we're going to be tying up recruitment approaches anyway if we're going to potentially be looking at day one rights. This is a good opportunity to really dive into your recruitment process and work out if the process by which you bring somebody on board is actually doing everything it needs to for your organization. So next thing to think about with this, if my screen will actually let me move on, we'll move on to the big one, data protection issues. So a few things to consider here. The use of personal data when you are training an AI system and in the prompts, the inputs that you give it. The question as to whether outputs from an AI system count as automated decision making for the purposes of GDPR. And your data protection obligations, I said to applicants there because I'm doing all of this through the framework of an application process, but of course that would also extend to existing employees and potentially third parties. I said we'd all get excited over GDPR at some point today. This is Article 22 of the UK GDPR, and this is about automated decision making. A data subject, regardless of who that is, has the right not to be subject to a decision based entirely on automated processing. That includes profiling in a way that produces a legal effect for them or similarly significantly affects them. The only exceptions to that is if that automated decision-making process is necessary for the performance of a contract between you and the data subject, or, and ideally, it's based on the data subject's express consent. So where does this create an issue? Twofold. One, automated CV vetting or application vetting, which is done entirely by an automated system. That is unlikely to be necessary for the performance of a contract. By definition, that contract doesn't exist yet. And unless you've got the data subject's express consent to do that, you're running the risk of being in breach of this automated decision-making process. The other area that it presents a potential risk for you is then sort of the next stage. So we've done the CV sift. It is then inputting all of that data, following maybe an interview process into a similar system and basically asking the question, which of these applicants should we hire? That is still likely to be a form of automated processing. Again, a contract doesn't exist yet. And again, you're unlikely to have the data subjects express consent. Now, yes, as part of this process, as part of an application, you could, of course, have on there, we're going to be using an automated decision-making process, and here's how we will be doing it. Do we have your consent to do so? But we're still subject to the next part of Article 22, because, of course, it's a UK piece of legislation about data protection. It doesn't stop there. So that significant decision, and that carries the same definition, something that produces a legal effect. And for these purposes, whether or not you offer somebody a job will be a legal effect. An employment relationship is a legally structured concept, so therefore it's a legal effect. A significant decision based entirely on that kind of processing, by which I mean decision making, particularly in relation to special category data, also cannot be taken based solely on automated processing. So here we then carry another risk. If an individual has disclosed to you in their application process that they have a medical condition or a disability, there's our special category of personal data, so we can't use that in the context of automated processing either, again, without the data subject specific consent or in relation to performance of a contract. So we are still struggling with the use here of special category data within an AI decision-making process, both for application process and for existing internal employees or workers. Data protection points to consider then. Are we processing personal data? Don't forget, this is kind of a checklist you will always work through when processing data and deciding whether you're doing so in a compliant way or not. Yes, in an application, in any decision-making process affecting an employee, if you're redacting it to the point where it's no longer personal data, there's probably no value in you sort of analysing it anyway. Do we have a lawful ground to process the data in the way we're doing so? Well, as an applicant, no, we don't have a contract yet. If they haven't given express consent, we can't rely on that one either. So we're stuck with legitimate interest. Do we have a legitimate interest in trying to verify the information the applicants put in their CV? Possibly. I'm not sure I'd want to try and argue that, but it might be there. You then also need to consider your privacy notice, your retention periods for that data. None of this is stuff that sort of crops up so far until this explosion of AI systems and tools are doing this. Your AI tool that you're using, if you're going to consider a degree of automated decision making, will be a brand new form of technology within your organization, almost certainly. A data protection impact assessment is therefore required, I would suggest. You may even want to go as far as replacing that with the word mandatory. I don't think you're going to get away with the ICO potentially looking into this and you not doing a data protection impact assessment on where that data is going, who it's potentially accessible by, and the basis that you're using it. There is now an extension of this as well to consider. There is always a right for a human review of a decision made by AI tools. This is quite important. The way we get around this and saying that it can't be taken solely based on automated processing is by having a human involved in the process. If somebody to whom a solely automated decision with that legal effect or similar requests that there is a human review of that decision-making process, they have to have it done. That is a right under GDPR, under both UK and European law. I'll park there just before moving on to discrimination risks. Myles, I don't know from your point of view whether there's anything you want to chip in on that. I appreciate that's very employment HR focused, but I suppose from a data protection point of view, maybe the question for you that we come to now rather than later is what are these risks when it comes to the data we're inputting, particularly into things like maybe ChatGPT, Copilot, whatever the case may be?
Well, the main thing is really you don't know what that data is going to be used for, if it is stored somewhere. Ideally, you don't want your private data to be processed in a way that the model can be trained upon or used if a potential leak were to occur, that data wouldn't then be visible to the public. So yeah, sort of going off what you said, really, it's mainly around the sorry, lost my train of thought there. Yeah, mainly around just you don't want to be putting that data in there. We don't know where it's stored.
Yeah, and this is why I'm saying that data protection impact assessment is so important. It might be fine that we know that this information is coming into our internal HR team. What are they doing with it? What's the line manager doing with it? What platform are they inputting it to? And by extension, who has then potentially got access to that? Well, as we say, in a sort of open public model that it is learning from inputs done by the public. Well, in principle, that's 8 billion people. And that is a genuine concern that I think needs to be considered when we're inputting any data into something that is publicly learning. Broadly related questions, so I'll chip in on it now. Would using an AI tool to summarize CVs but not explicitly decide to hire, potentially not, fall foul of the GDPR clauses, there's still a human looking at it? So the summary, I don't think a problem. Summarizing the CV is not making a decision on that individual. It's compiling the information they produced and putting it in a more simple format. I would question the value in doing that, of course, because most CVs are not multiple pages long. It may well just be quicker to actually sit and read the thing. But I don't think it triggers the need for the human to review afterwards, because the decision isn't being made to solely engage in a legal outcome or not for that individual based on the automated process itself. It's not an automated decision making, it's a summary of information. All of the other data protection issues do still kick in, though, as we were just saying. Has that AI tool, where is that data being held once it's been inputted? So next, moving on, discrimination risks. So apart from the data protection side, we've touched on this already, and Myles summarised it nicely earlier for us. All AI models are going to learn from some form of data entry. So there's all sorts of risks here. I flagged a few there. Let's talk about it from a recruitment process first. People who speak English as an additional language. Those of us who speak more than one language will know that generally, when you're up to reasonably competent but maybe slightly foul of fluent, we'll have quite a formal way of expressing ourselves in that additional or second language. That's true here as well. And one of the things that we were talking about earlier with the plagiarism and the detection side of things, AI-generated content does tend to have this slightly formal sentence structure, this slightly formal syntax, but so do speakers of additional languages. And the risk of that is there's no way of distinguishing between them at the moment. There's no easy way of going, this is the way somebody who speaks English as an additional language would structure this, and this is the way that a ChatGPT trying to come across as a native English speaker would put this. So there is a risk there that somebody who has written something as a non-native speaker is going to be flagged as it having been AI generated. If you then reject on that basis, that's a potential discrimination claim. Again, automated decision-making may not take into account the justification or the reason behind something. So if somebody's got a gap in their employment, what if that was maternity leave? What if it was time off because of a disability? Without that human input, we've got no way of knowing that, because so many of us don't write that on our CVs, funnily enough. We've talked about disability, we've talked about equality of access, so thank you for the question earlier, that was quite useful, because yes, the flip side of all of this is making use of AI tools are potential reasonable adjustments. And we need to be balancing perhaps our maybe instinctive feeling not to use them because of all of the concerns, but the fact again that this is a powerful tool, both in terms of productivity, but also in terms of ensuring equality of access in the workplace. And that's why the risk of an absolute ban is also potentially a disability issue. As with any new tech, it gets you coming and going, and that's why it's important to start thinking about these things as soon as we can and early on. So, continuing on that theme a little bit then, I'm sure Myles will be able to chip in on a few of these because he'll have heard of a few of them. Between 2014 and 2018, Amazon was using an AI-powered CV screening tool, and they eventually managed to discover that it was filtering out basically women. So, for example, it was rejecting CVs that had, this was based in the US primarily, fortunately, but it was filtering out CVs where the applicant said they'd attended a women's college. It was filtering out CVs where somebody had said that they were the women's tennis captain, these kind of things. And the reason for that, it was going into technical roles. Well, if you take the 10 years of data prior to 2004, where were the vast majority of applicants coming from? They were generally men in that sector. And again, this goes back to what Myles was saying earlier about the data that is being inputted, what is being learned from here in order to produce today's results. And I think that's a really good example of what you were driving at, Myles, as where this data comes from.
Yeah.
Manjang and Uber Eats I've talked about before. People will be familiar with this if they've attended an in-person event. This is a UK one. I'll only touch on it very briefly because I have discussed it before. But what happened here was when Uber Eats drivers were logging into their part of the system, they were required to do a facial recognition check. And what came out of this case was the fact that the system they were using was ultimately AI generated. You know, I'm logging in, I'm so-and-so. The system would then do its facial scan and conclude whether that person was or was not the person who was allegedly signing in. And they discovered that the system couldn't distinguish between different people of colour, certainly not with the same accuracy that it could with Caucasian people. This was an indirect discrimination claim. The platform applied to everybody, of course, so it wasn't just discriminating against people of colour. The EHRC got involved. They intervened in the case because it was such a new technological development. It was ultimately settled out in court, but the fact is it did proceed. It was a potentially viable claim that the use of this platform, even though Uber Eats didn't have complete control over it, was capable, in theory, of being an indirect discrimination issue. So equality issues when shortlisting or decision making. We've already talked about the involvement of a human somewhere in that process, even if it's not triggered, even if the individual doesn't say, I want this decision reviewed by a human, it is worth including a human in the process regardless. Yes, a human might be discriminatory themselves, but at least that's going to be potentially identifiable. There's ways of vetting that. There's ways of overseeing what an individual human is doing as much as there is an AI tool. Random spot tests, sampling, testing, deliberately create a CV that might flag as an issue for some reason and see if it makes its way through the system. See what your tool is doing and whether it is actually producing the right results in a non-discriminatory way. Not something I've done, not something I've been involved in. Myles, feel free to chip in on that point if you want to. But I think one of the only ways of testing a system that is potentially inherently flawed is by creating something problematic and seeing what it does with it.
Yeah, that's sort of like most things.
Yeah, classic bug spotting.
Try and break it.
Yeah, that's an IT answer for you, everybody.
Yeah.
And the last thing there, update privacy notices, update your data protection risk, update your impact assessments in terms of data protection as well. If you're starting to use these new tools, think about everything we're mentioning. Think again, basically. Think about it from the perspective of you are using an external contractor. That is the only way you can realistically think about this. Where is our data going? Where is my employees' data going? Who potentially has access to that? So, confidentiality and intellectual property, confidential business information inputted into, and you know, I've used the large language model acronym there. That is ultimately the issue here. We've got a platform that is learning. What happens if we put data into it? Who owns the content produced by an AI platform? And what happens if we accidentally leak commercial or customer client data, or indeed someone deliberately does so? So I want to start with IP and ownership rights first, because that's, in a sense, the easy one. I am not an IP specialist. If anybody is making sort of extensive use of AI generative content in their workplace and wants more detail on the IP and ownership rights side of that, please do message me separately. I know a couple of IP lawyers who you will be able to talk to about that. What I can tell you from an employment perspective, we all as employers rely on the Copyright Designs and Patents Act 88. Basically, that says you own what your employee produces in their work time or on their work resources or using work systems. That's nice and easy. Most of us have got it expressly set out in contracts and policies as well. Absolutely failing that, we rely on that piece of legislation. Section 9(3) of that act goes on to say that ownership of technically generated content, and how it's worded in here, obviously in 1988 it wasn't envisaging generative AI. What it says is where there's no identifiable author to the content, and what that's generally taken to mean is that it would cover generative AI as well. Ownership belongs to the person who arranges the creation, and by extension of the rest of the act, that can still be said, I think, to mean the employer. That said, again, if you're going to be making effective, productive, and regular use of generative AI tools, tidy up your contract terms on IP. Make it expressly clear that anything your employee generates using your system or any other system in work time, on work resources, or by virtue of their employment belongs to you. Simple reasons for that. If it does end up being the next AI generated bestseller, I think you're going to want in on those rights. Confidentiality and business information. We've talked about this to some extent. Myles, I'll pass to you in a moment here in terms of maybe getting out of this as best you can. I've given the example of OpenAI remembering absolutely everything until last year that was being inputted into ChatGPT by default. That was their learning model. Most of these systems are relying on you as the inputter voluntarily saying, yes, I'd love to help this model learn by giving it all of my data. And that's the default with quite a few of them, or certainly historically has been. So I've given you there what I understand are the current settings you want to go to if you don't want OpenAI, particularly ChatGPT, to be making use of the data you input. That's not an absolute safety net, of course. That is just the please stop using my data to try and improve your systems setting. But Myles, anything you want to chip in on at this point? Because I think this ties in nicely to what you were saying about how these systems learn and acquire their data.
Yeah, so especially with public tools like ChatGPT, they're all, as I say, they're all trained on the data that's fed to them by the public eye. I know that some private tools do still use that data, but you can opt out for that. That's just a bit of research. So if your business uses the Microsoft ecosystem, then you can opt out of that if you fancy using Copilot. I think it's called business protection, so it's worth speaking to your IT team about that. They should be able to turn that off for the whole firm, or turn it on rather for the whole firm. But yeah, they should give you the option to opt out of that, improving the model for everyone.
Yeah, like I said, that's often what they're hiding behind. We all know sort of various platforms, not just AI platforms, that do that. Obviously, you know, Twitter did the same thing. Facebook do the same thing. It's all about making use of the data that's on ultimately a system that you're accessing as a consumer. Business sensitive information. So a major issue that cropped up in Samsung early 2023. One engineer asked ChatGPT to fix a coding issue for a semiconductor database. What they'd actually managed to do was input into ChatGPT, and don't forget this is in the period where OpenAI was potentially storing, disseminating and using that information, a whole host of proprietary code. Not a great idea, particularly when you're in the tech industry yourself, to be making use of tech systems to breach your own business sensitive information. As I say, actually affected 3 employees here. Another they discovered had entered specs to ask for code optimization, and a third asked to summarize confidential meeting notes. Now, again, at the time, this was still in place. And in theory, that highly sensitive proprietary code that belonged to Samsung has just entered the public domain as a result of them doing that. And this ties in nicely to what Myles was saying about learning. In theory, all that then takes is a third party to have a general idea. Please tell me about Samsung's code for their semiconductors. And the idea is that the system has learned to make that connection and provide that information. Is that a fair summary, Myles?
Yeah, that is a fair summary. Within reason, you know, it would take a lot of people to, you know, put in these different types of information for it to essentially learn. You know, it's not like small branch off stems. It's the name large language model is that it takes that large amount of data and learns behind it. But yeah, again, the idea of it learning about that information is not ideal.
Excellent, thank you. It's glad to know that I'm kind of on the right path sometimes. Very, very broad sense. If I want to panic people, I'm doing the right thing. That's the important one. So, client data, customer data. This is obviously the one that we as a law firm are particularly concerned about. This is the area where we risk being shut down, struck off, disciplined, all of these sorts of things. Do not forget your GDPR rights of customers, of clients. So we have taken the absolute view, doesn't matter in a sense what the platform is, confidential customer client information does not go into an AI platform, into an AI mod. And I think that's probably the right approach when you've got as high a burden on us as we do. The risk of that being exposed is so extreme that it would lead to disciplinary action, it would lead to regulatory action, it would lead to the firm potentially being shut down for a serious enough breach. And I do think that's the right approach in particularly medical, particularly legal, those kind of areas. Medical regulators, the SRA for us, the ICO have already flagged these concerns. Read their guidance if you're in a relevant sector. everybody read the ICO guidance on this, because they do talk about some of the things we've been discussing today. And don't forget that in principle, I'm not aware of it ever actually having been used to a great extent, but there is a criminal liability for data protection breaches under the Data Protection Act 2018. Somebody knowingly, seriously, recklessly, maliciously exposing confidential data can face criminal liability. If you're thinking about this internally and you want to scare your staff, I suppose, to an extent, that is the thing that you're relying on here. There is this ultimate risk of a criminal sanction. This isn't just a fine. This isn't just the ICO getting involved and shouting at us. Other risk areas that I won't touch on the first two in too much detail. They're areas that if we had 2 hours, I'd probably have asked Myles to talk about in a bit more detail. But these platforms, these models, these do carry data breach risks. These do carry cyber security concerns. Media attention on deep fake, synthetic media. So think about all of this within the context of your cyber security training and policies that you're implementing. Generative AI is capable of producing very realistic sort of voice, video, written content that may be perceived as coming from somebody legitimately within a business. AI is actively being used by cyber criminals. There is no reason to believe that that will stop, slow down, or in any way get easier to detect. So do be conscious of all of that when you're talking about the use of AI, whether internally or general awareness of how platforms are being used in a bad way. I will also go back to one more equality point that's quite important, and that is the question of harassment. Consider very seriously here the recent changes to the law and the upcoming ones. We have a duty to prevent sexual harassment. We're about to have a duty to take all steps to prevent sexual harassment, and third-party harassment is coming back on the statute books at some point. There are 2 cases I want to talk about here just to be very, very aware of. The first is a platform called Replica. The free version of this was framed as a platonic companion app. There was a paid version which could get more intimate. It was discovered very, very quickly online that even the free version of this was capable of becoming sexually suggestive and beyond. This included to minors. This included to sexual assault and sexual harassment victims. And this included people, well, across the board, really, even people who haven't necessarily initiated what they thought was going to be a sexualized conversation with this platform. That is an extreme example. The platform, the resource still exists. It is still out there because part of it was the intention, but consider the seriousness of that. Unwanted advances of a sexual nature. Well, if that's happening in the workplace, that ticks the sexual harassment box for Section 26 of the Equality Act. Microsoft's very, very short-lived piece of AI software that they tried to develop. I'm sure Myles will be familiar with this one. It was trained to learn from Twitter, of all things. X as now is. Those of you who have ever had a Twitter account will know the content that is occasionally exposed on Twitter. And what Tay basically did was read Twitter for us and produce some automated content for us to churn out. Now, the problem with that is a huge amount of the content that it was learning from on Twitter was racist, sexist, inflammatory, and Microsoft discovered, like I said, I think it was within 16 hours, it was certainly within a day, that the content that this platform was generating was itself then being racist, sexist, inflammatory, to the point where I believe at one time it was glorifying Hitler and the Nazis and some of their policies. It was taken down incredibly quickly by their engineers, but of course the point is that content had been produced and was accessible. Why is this important to us from an employment and HR perspective? Well, it goes back to what I was just saying a moment ago. The definition of harassment, unwanted conduct, connected to one of the protected characteristics or of a sexual nature, which has the purpose or effect of violating dignity, creating a hostile, offensive, etc. environment. Nothing in that definition says there has to be a human perpetrator. Therefore, in theory, harassment by, whether it's intended or not, an AI platform or AI being used in order to harass people is all potentially going to be covered, and does potentially, where those systems are accessible in your workplace, need to form part of your harassment risk assessment. I'm not aware of a legal case on this yet, but no doubt one will come in the near future. Very, very quickly then, staff acceptable use. What do we do moving forwards with this? Be mindful of over-reliance and errors in particular. I'll come on to a few more of them in a moment. The reputational risk from misuse, your legal exposure that we've covered today, whether that's data protection, discriminatory, breach of contract, loss of internal or business sensitive information. The risk of cutting corners and plagiarising. For example, not spell checking one of your slides and missing an S off the word corners. The important one to use and think about how we are managing this. Those of you who know me well will know I'm not a policy for policy's sake person, but I think this is one that's important. You want an extension of your acceptable IT use policy to include AI systems, to include AI platforms. You need to balance, and this is where it becomes a strategic board level issue, the balance of risk and being left behind in the workplace. As we said at the start, there are huge opportunities in using AI systems to generate stuff that currently takes a human 3, 4, 5 hours. That can be cut multiple times in half. Best example I can give very quickly, those of you who were at our mock ET hearing back in June, almost all of that content was AI generated in about 40 minutes. The one I've done in previous life took me several days to put all of that together. It did a pretty good job on the whole. So acceptable use policies, I don't think a knee-jerk, let's ban it all is necessarily the right approach. And as we've alluded to earlier, I think Myles and many other people would agree with me on that. But at the same time, you need to be balancing all of these risks and concerns. Other things to think about, AI-generated policies, procedures, letters, and outcomes. So I've just had questions about sort of grievance processes and things like that. So could arguments be made to appeal internal grievance processes if meeting summaries are produced by AI under the guise that they miss key points? Yes, absolutely. If somebody doesn't agree with the notes of an internal procedure or policy or meeting or whatever the case may be, that is always grounds of an appeal anyway, whether that's been produced by a human or whether that's been produced by an AI system. Again, this is the importance of double checking and ensuring that mistakes are not being made or that they're being picked up when they are made. The other place we're increasingly starting to see things, AI-generated grievances and the use of AI in legal proceedings themselves. Again, this is why it's a particular concern for us. An AI-generated grievance, I mean, if you input into ChatGPT, here's a load of stuff that's happened to me, please write me a 20-page grievance, it will do so. It may be rubbish, it may cite all kinds of nonsense, it may apply the wrong law at times, but it will produce it. And as we all know, when a grievance lands on our desks, we deal with it, we address it, we pick it up. So just touching on that very briefly and some of the more amusing risks in legal proceedings, a couple of major cases here. That first one there is actually a couple of years old now. The claimant used ChatGPT to do almost everything here. It wrote her legal submissions for her, it wrote her witness statements. The employment judge at the time basically concluded that he didn't believe the claimant understood the case she was pursuing. Because it was so incoherent and because what she was saying verbally was so contradictory and mismatched with what she was saying in her written submissions. There's also been a couple of famous cases here, this side of the pond and also in the States, of lawyers getting caught out in court presenting fake case citations. I say that as an example from my professional area. If it's doing that and if an AI system is able to get a case citation wrong and miscite the law, miscite a legal case that has actually happened, it is more than capable of getting almost anything else wrong as well. Like we said all the way through, it learns. It gives you a best outcome based on what you input and based on what it knows. It doesn't necessarily give you the truth. And I think that's basically it. We've got literally under a minute to go. I haven't got anything else to add, Myles, unless there's anything else from you. I think we've answered questions. Please do feel free to wrap up if there's anything you want to say.
Oh, I think we've covered that quite well.
Excellent. In that case, I think we've covered off the questions as well, having all been posed by who exactly we expected to, so thank you for that. If anybody else has got any questions, I'll be here for a couple more minutes just to wrap up. Otherwise, Myles, thank you for joining. Your input's been absolutely invaluable. I'm sure everybody will agree with me on that. For everybody else on the call, next session, as I indicated at the start, will be the last one of this year, Wednesday, 3rd of December. Slightly more relaxed, slightly less formal session. We'll do a legal roundup, bit of a look back at some of the more exciting and interesting cases from the year, look forward at what we're expecting to crop up in the future. Please do join us for that one. We've hit 11 o'clock. I will stop the recording there. Everybody have a wonderful day, wonderful month, and I will see you all hopefully on Wednesday, the 3rd of December. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you again, Myles.
Take care.